Madison Harrison was 8 months pregnant when her husband, billionaire CEO Thomas Wycliffe, began locking their bedroom door every night, not to protect her, but to punish her. What began as subtle control spiraled into something far darker, until a strange birthmark on their newborn child revealed a secret Thomas thought he had buried forever. Thomas Wycliffe had it all. At least, that's what the world believed. His face was splashed across magazines and business journals labeled as a genius of the modern real estate boom. With a sleek office in Manhattan and a private estate tucked away in the quiet hills of Westchester, Thomas moved through life like he owned it. Cameras followed him at charity galas. Financial reporters quoted his insights like gospel. His image was that of a self-made billionaire who built an empire from the ground up. His followers admired his discipline. His rivals feared his ruthlessness. But no one ever questioned the other part of his life, the one he kept carefully hidden behind thick walls and tinted windows. Eleanor Wycliffe had once believed she was marrying a visionary. When she first met Thomas, he was charming, intense, and persuasive. He swept her off her feet in a matter of weeks. Their whirlwind romance had felt like a dream. Expensive dinners, surprise gifts, a proposal on a yacht off the coast of Santorini. She had never known anyone with so much confidence, so much power. But shortly after the wedding, the illusion cracked. The first sign came in the form of silence. Thomas grew distant when they returned from their honeymoon. He stopped asking about her day. He rarely smiled. Then came the rules. Eleanor was not to leave the estate without permission. She could no longer use her personal phone. He replaced it with one that had only 3 contacts programmed. Her wardrobe changed. Her diet was monitored. Her every move became something to manage and correct. And when she asked why, he only said it was for her protection. It was easier not to argue. In time, the rules turned into punishments. At first, they were emotional. The coldness, the dismissive words, the guilt. But they soon became physical. It started small. A sharp grip on her wrist, a shove, then worse. Always at night. Always when no one else was around, and always followed by silence the next morning, as if nothing had happened. Eleanor would sit across from Thomas at breakfast, bruises hidden beneath her sleeves, pretending to read the paper while he discussed market trends. The staff at the mansion rotated frequently. Maids, cooks, even the security guards never lasted more than a few weeks. It wasn't hard to see why. Thomas was demanding, controlling, and quick to fire anyone who stepped out of line. Most of them turned a blind eye to Eleanor's situation, either out of fear or indifference. Some might have suspected, but none stayed long enough to get involved. The mansion itself, immaculate, cold, and silent, became a cage. Eleanor walked its halls alone during the day, tracing the edges of paintings she didn't pick, and staring out windows she couldn't open. Her only companion was the child growing inside her. When Eleanor discovered she was pregnant, she hoped something would change. Maybe Thomas would soften. Maybe he'd see her differently. Maybe love, in some quiet way, would begin to grow where control had lived. For a brief moment, she thought she saw it in his eyes when she told him. He didn't speak. He just stared at her, then nodded and walked away. That night, he didn't punish her. She almost cried from the relief. But the peace didn't last. The next night, he resumed. The pain returned. So did the fear. Pregnancy didn't change Thomas. It made him more careful, more calculated. The punishments became less visible, more psychological. And still, every morning she sat across from him, pretending nothing was wrong. Eleanor kept her suffering quiet. But she wasn't helpless. Despite everything, she still had her mind, her memory, and a single secret, something she had never told Thomas. Her life before him was not what he thought it was. Her name wasn't always Eleanor. Her past wasn't as simple as he believed. In fact, nothing about her presence in his life was accidental. But she had to play the role. Every movement, every smile, every carefully timed word was part of something bigger. At night, when Thomas went to his study to review security footage, Eleanor would sit by the nursery and place her hand gently on her stomach. She whispered promises to her unborn child, promises she hoped she could keep. She told herself she had time, that all this pain had a purpose, that soon, very soon, things would change. The mansion had nearly 100 rooms, yet Eleanor felt trapped in every one of them. The grand chandelier in the foyer didn't sparkle to her. The velvet drapes and marble floors didn't feel luxurious. They felt like layers of a tomb. She knew the layout better than anyone else, having memorized each hall and blind spot. She noticed which cameras had blinking red lights and which ones didn't. She knew how long the security guards patrolled each wing and when the staff took their breaks. She had no phone of her own, no contact with the outside world. But she had patience. She had memory. And more than anything, she had reason. As her belly grew, so did the tension. Thomas became more erratic. He asked strange questions. He accused her of things she hadn't done. Looking out the window too long, smiling during a phone call with the doctor, pausing before answering a question. The punishments escalated again. There were nights when Eleanor thought she might not survive to morning. But she never fought back. Not yet. She had to wait. Because she knew something Thomas didn't. The child she was carrying wasn't just a baby. It was a key. A key to the past. A key to everything he had hidden and thought was forgotten. One evening, as a thunderstorm rolled over the hills, Eleanor sat alone in the nursery, staring at the crib that had arrived earlier that day. White wood, pale blue ribbon, expensive. Empty. She touched her stomach and breathed in slowly. There were bruises on her arms, but she didn't cry. Not anymore. She couldn't afford to. The walls around her weren't just walls. They were closing in. But she wasn't afraid, because soon everything would change. The mansion stood like a silent sentinel in the hills, wrapped in marble, glass, and secrets. During the day, it looked like a monument to wealth, with its sweeping staircases, imported, chandeliers, and flawless landscaping. But at night, it transformed. Shadows stretched long across the polished floors. Lights dimmed to a low, eerie glow. Doors creaked open and closed on their own as the wind crawled through unseen cracks. And behind the walls, something far more chilling stirred. Eyes that never blinked, always watching. Thomas Wycliffe had the house outfitted with one of the most advanced private surveillance systems in the state. There were cameras in every hallway, every room except the bathrooms, and even some of the closets. They were expertly hidden behind smoke detectors, light fixtures, and inside decorative moldings. No corner of the house was left uncovered. Each night. Thomas sat in his private study, reviewing footage from the day. He watched Eleanor eat breakfast. He watched her read in the library. He watched her rest in the nursery. Nothing escaped his gaze. He told himself this was necessary. He told himself it was love. that protecting his wife and unborn child required full control. But what Thomas didn't say, what he didn't even allow himself to think, was that he wasn't watching to protect. He was watching to dominate. He needed to see her, study her, confirm that she wasn't hiding anything, that she was still his. Entirely. At first, Eleanor didn't know about the cameras, but it didn't take her long to notice the subtle hums, the tiny lights that sometimes blinked when she moved. Once she knew, she pretended not to. She smiled at the walls. She stayed within view. She played the perfect role. But inside, she was quietly building a map in her mind, of which cameras had slight delays, which areas were blind spots, and which ones, strangely, weren't connected to Thomas's surveillance system. It was a small clue, but it led her to something unexpected. The nursery had a camera in the corner, identical to all the others in the house. But this one didn't match. It didn't blink. It didn't hum. And more importantly, it didn't appear on any of the screens in Thomas's study. Eleanor had seen the feeds once, months ago, when Thomas forgot to lock the door behind him. She memorized the layout of every screen and every room shown. The nursery wasn't among them, the high tier. Next day, when Thomas left for a business meeting in the city, Eleanor examined the camera more closely. It wasn't hardwired into the wall like the others. It had a hidden battery pack. It was smaller, newer, more discreet. Someone else had put it there. Someone besides Thomas. That night, Thomas returned in a foul mood. Eleanor watched him from across the dinner table. His jaw was tense. His responses were short. He didn't touch his food. After dinner, he went straight to the study. Hours later, he came out, furious. He stormed past her without a word, slammed the door to his bedroom, and didn't come out until morning. Eleanor didn't need to ask. She already knew what he had found, or rather, what he hadn't found. The nursery camera was transmitting. Somewhere else. Someone else was watching. Days later, Thomas began receiving packages. They were hand-delivered by couriers, never left in the mailbox. Always plain brown boxes. No return address. Inside, each one were printed photographs, grainy, black and white, but unmistakable. They were of Eleanor. Some were taken in the bedroom, others in the kitchen or walking the halls. But the angles were unfamiliar, different from those captured by Thomas's system. Worse, they showed her bruises, her pain, her isolation. At first, Thomas thought it was a threat, that someone was trying to blackmail him. But the packages never asked for money. There were no notes, no demands, just more photographs. With each delivery, Thomas grew more agitated. He yelled more, drank more. He fired the remaining house staff, claiming they couldn't be trusted. He replaced the locks, checked every corner of the mansion for hidden devices. But he never found the source. Eleanor watched it all unfold silently. She kept her expression blank, her tone soft, her steps light. But inside, she was burning. She knew what the photos meant. Someone else knew the truth. Someone else had seen what Thomas had done. And they weren't afraid to expose it. The packages didn't stop. In fact, they increased. Soon they came every 2 or 3 days, always with more pictures, always more recent. Thomas grew paranoid. He checked the security system hourly. He moved the servers to a reinforced room in the basement. He threatened to install motion sensors in every hallway. He accused Eleanor of being involved, then apologized the next morning. But she never gave him anything, just the same quiet obedience, the same hollow eyes. One evening, Thomas noticed something that broke his already fraying mind. A photograph showed Eleanor standing at the front window, her hand pressed against the glass. Behind her, in the reflection, was Thomas, sitting at his desk, watching the monitors. The angle of the photo made one thing clear. It was taken from inside the house. Someone had been there. Inside. Close enough to watch both of them, and he hadn't noticed. That night, Thomas didn't review the footage. He just sat in his study, motionless, staring at the walls. Eleanor could hear the silence from the hallway, thick and oppressive. He didn't come to bed. He didn't speak to her the next day. Something had shifted. Eleanor knew what he was thinking. If someone could enter the house undetected, could hide cameras, could take photos and vanish without a trace, then everything Thomas believed about his power, his control, was a lie. And if he couldn't control his home, then maybe he couldn't control her either. Still, he didn't stop the punishments. They continued, night after night, his rage now tinged with desperation. But his blows were less certain, his voice less confident. And Eleanor, though still quiet, felt a growing strength. She knew someone was watching, someone who had seen the truth. And soon, she would no longer be alone. She sat in the nursery one afternoon, hands resting gently on her swollen belly, staring at the small hidden camera across the room. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. But she nodded. Just once. Barely. A movement. And the tiny green light on the camera blinked once in return. The storm arrived without warning, swallowing the sky in thick, gray clouds that rolled over the hills like waves. Wind howled through the trees, bending them sideways, and rain lashed against the mansion's windows like angry fingers. It was the kind of night that made the world feel far away, unreachable. Inside the cold, cavernous house, Eleanor felt it coming too. Not just the storm outside, but the one inside her. The baby was coming. She had felt it in small waves for hours, starting as a dull ache in her lower back, then tightening in her abdomen like an invisible fist. By evening, the contractions had grown sharper, closer together, impossible to ignore. She leaned against the nursery wall, breathing through the pain, her fingers gripping the edge of the changing table. She called out for Thomas once, then again. He didn't answer. Finally he appeared, expression tight, eyes sharp. He stood in the doorway and stared at her, saying nothing for several seconds as thunder cracked above the house. When she told him it was time, his jaw clenched. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't panic. Instead, he made a call, not to a hospital, but to a private doctor. He didn't want her leaving the mansion, not even for this. By the time the doctor arrived, the storm had cut power across half the property. Emergency lights flickered on, bathing the hallways in a dim red hue. The backup generator rumbled from beneath the garage. The doctor, an older man with a briefcase and a quiet voice, set up in the bedroom. Eleanor was helped onto the bed, her body trembling, soaked in sweat and fear. The pain tore through her in waves, each one worse than the last, and the only voice she heard was the doctor's, calm and distant, giving instructions in a low tone. Thomas stood nearby, watching, always watching. He didn't hold her hand. He didn't speak. He simply observed, as if the birth was another piece of data to analyze, another event to control. His eyes never left her face, not with concern, but with suspicion. When the baby's head began to crown, he moved closer. Something in his expression changed. It wasn't excitement. It was unease. Then the child was born. A small cry pierced the silence, soft and high. The doctor wrapped the baby in a white blanket and placed him gently in Eleanor's arms. She looked down at her son, his tiny face pale and scrunched, his fists curled tight. For a moment everything else fell away, the pain, the fear, the weight of the house pressing down on her. For the first time in months, she felt something close to peace. But then Thomas stepped closer, and the moment shattered. He looked down at the baby, his brows knitting together. His hand reached out, pulling back the blanket slowly, revealing the newborn's shoulder. There, beneath the curve of soft skin, was a dark, crescent-shaped mark, like a shadow that refused to fade. A birthmark. Thomas froze. For a long moment, the room was silent. The doctor, unaware of the meaning behind Thomas's expression, quietly packed his tools and prepared to leave. But Thomas remained rooted to the spot, staring at the mark. He knew it. Not just vaguely. He knew it exactly. The shape, the size, the placement. He had seen it before, years ago on another child. A child he thought was gone. Thomas's mind spiraled. Long-buried memories clawed their way to the surface. The affair, the woman, the baby. It had all been handled, cleaned up, erased. Or so he believed. He had paid to make it disappear, paid a great deal. But now, standing before him, was undeniable proof that the past wasn't finished with him. Later that night, long after the doctor had gone and Eleanor had drifted into an exhausted sleep, Thomas locked himself in his study. He poured himself a drink but didn't touch it. Instead, he sat in the dark, staring at the image of the baby's face in his mind, the birthmark burning into his thoughts like a brand. He opened his computer and placed a quiet phone call to a private lab, demanding a DNA test. No questions, no delays. Samples were collected the next day without Eleanor's knowledge. The results would take 3 days. Those 3 days stretched into a lifetime. Thomas barely spoke to Eleanor during that time. He watched her more closely than ever, but said little. He barely slept. When the results finally arrived, delivered in a plain envelope, he opened them alone. The paper was simple. Clinical, no emotion. Paternity result, negative. The child was not his. Everything Thomas had built his world around began to unravel. The mansion, the marriage, the perfect public image, it had all been for nothing. He had controlled every part of Eleanor's life, watched her every step, and still she had deceived him. Or so he thought. His first reaction was fury, not just at Eleanor, but at himself. How could he have missed this? How long had it been going on? Who was the father? Was it one of the staff he had fired? A stranger she met on the rare occasions? He let her leave the house? Or worse, was it someone from before she became Eleanor? The possibilities tormented him. But beneath the rage was something colder. A feeling he didn't understand, not fear, not jealousy, something unfamiliar. As if a game he thought he had been winning had been rigged against him from the beginning. The birthmark haunted him. It was a symbol of something deeper, something tangled in his past, something he couldn't name. He returned to the nursery the next day, standing silently over the crib as the baby slept. The mark was still there, faint but clear. He reached out and touched it with one finger. The child stirred but didn't cry. Thomas turned and left the room. That night, he didn't go to his study. He didn't check the cameras. He didn't touch Eleanor. He sat in the grand hallway, alone, listening to the sound of rain dripping through a crack in the ceiling. His empire was intact, but something inside it, inside him, was broken. He couldn't say why, but he felt it in his bones. The past had returned, not as a ghost, but as flesh and blood. And it was just beginning. The days that followed the DNA test result passed like a fever dream, thick with silence and unease. The mansion, once a symbol of power and perfection, now felt like a prison built of suspicion. Its grand halls echoed too loudly, as if the house itself had grown aware of the lies it held. The staff didn't return. The phones stopped ringing. And in the center of it all sat Thomas, unraveling. He no longer watched the surveillance footage. The screens in his study remained dark, gathering dust. He stopped taking calls from his investors. Meetings were missed. Contracts left unsigned. For the first time in years, Thomas let his empire drift, as if none of it mattered anymore. Something had changed in him, something fundamental. It wasn't just that the baby wasn't his. It was the realization that for all his control, for all his systems and security and money, he had been powerless to stop the one thing he feared most: betrayal. Eleanor noticed the shift immediately. Thomas no longer barked commands or questioned her every move. He wandered the house like a ghost, silent and distracted, his sharp eyes dulled with confusion. She still bore the bruises from his final outburst, a fading map of his anger drawn across her skin. But he hadn't touched her. Since, not out of mercy, but because he was afraid, not of her, of the truth. Eleanor took advantage of the silence. She spent long hours in the nursery with the baby, cradling him in the quiet, rocking him gently in the worn wooden chair that creaked with every sway. She no longer looked at the hidden camera across the room. She no longer needed to. Whoever had been watching had already done what Eleanor never could. They had broken Thomas Wycliffe from the inside. But the mansion was not done giving up its secrets. One night, as Eleanor lay half asleep in bed, she heard something. Not the usual creaks or hums, but a mechanical whirring, slow and deliberate. She slipped from the bed and followed the sound down the hall, barefoot and cautious. The noise led her to the west wing, a part of the house Thomas rarely used. The hallways were darker here, the lights dimmed lower than usual. At the end of the corridor stood a door she hadn't opened before. She pushed it gently. Inside was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. She hesitated, then descended. The staircase ended in a room she didn't know existed. It was small and cold, filled with racks of servers, cables, and blinking lights. The air smelled metallic and damp, like rain on old wires. In the center of the room was a desk, with a single computer monitor glowing pale blue. But what caught her eye wasn't the technology, it was the wall behind it, covered floor to ceiling with photographs. Her photographs, hundreds of them, some recent, some from years ago. Her walking in the garden, her reading in the library, her asleep in bed. There were pictures from before the marriage, too. Eleanor laughing with friends, sitting in a cafe, boarding a train. Photos she had never seen before, taken from a distance, stolen moments. Her entire life, documented without her knowledge. Eleanor stepped closer. Among the photographs were documents, medical files, school records, a report from a private investigator detailing her movements before she met Thomas. And then, something else. An envelope marked "Confidential." Inside were two photos she didn't recognize. One was of a young woman, her face strikingly similar to Eleanor's, standing outside a courthouse. The second was of a baby with a crescent-shaped birthmark on his shoulder. It wasn't her child. Eleanor stared at the images, trying to make sense of them. There was no name on the photos, no explanation. But the implication was clear. Someone else had once carried a child with that same mark. And that child, like hers, was connected to Thomas. She took the envelope and left the room quietly, making sure to relock the door behind her. Back in her room, she laid the photos beside her sleeping baby and stared at the tiny crescent on his skin. Was this child part of something larger? Something buried in Thomas's past? The next day, Eleanor began searching. She combed through the house, the archives in Thomas's office, the drawers and safes he thought she didn't know about. She found references to court settlements, sealed documents, and cryptic emails dated nearly a decade earlier, shortly after Thomas acquired his third company. Names had been redacted, accounts deleted. But a pattern was there. A woman had come forward. She had accused Thomas of manipulation, coercion, and fathering a child he refused to acknowledge. Her case never went public. Thomas had paid her to disappear. And now, it seemed, that child had found his way back. Eleanor didn't understand how or why. But someone had known. Someone had left the photos, planted the camera, sent the packages. And that someone had been watching long before the baby was born. That night, she confronted Thomas, not with words, but with silence. She laid the envelope on the table in front of him, turned, and walked away. She didn't look back. Thomas sat there for a long time, staring at the images, the documents, the truth he had tried to bury. The mark on the child was not just a quirk of genetics. It was a sign, a thread that connected everything, his past sins, his hidden life, and the woman he had tried to control. It all circled back to that mark, that child, and now to Eleanor. He went to the nursery that night, long after the house had gone quiet. The baby was asleep, his chest rising and falling with soft breaths. Thomas stood over him, trembling. For the first time in years, he felt something real. Not power, not rage, but regret. He didn't touch the child. He simply turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the hall. In the shadows outside, rain began to fall again. Not loud, not angry, just steady, cleansing. And far beneath the mansion, in a small hidden room, the blinking lights on the servers continued their quiet rhythm. Watching, recording, remembering. The calm storm passed as quietly as it came, leaving behind a sky scrubbed clean and a mansion that felt strangely hollow. The air was lighter, but the silence heavier. Within those walls, something had shifted irreversibly. The house no longer breathed with the rhythm of control. It had grown still, almost cautious, like it knew its master had fallen out of sync with the world he built. Thomas didn't speak for days. He barely ate. He wandered from room to room as if searching for something lost, or trying to escape a presence he could no longer ignore. His footsteps echoed off marble floors, trailing behind him like accusations. He watched the baby from a distance now, not with suspicion, but with a quiet, desperate kind of sorrow. The child no longer represented betrayal. He represented a mirror, a reminder, a past mistake that had come home, carried by someone he had underestimated. Eleanor, no longer afraid, kept to herself. She tended to her son, humming to him softly, as she dressed his wounds and changed his clothes. Her movements were gentle but certain, as though every motion was part of a plan. She had seen Thomas crumble, and in his unraveling, she found clarity. She wasn't a prisoner anymore. She was something else now, witness, mother, survivor. But the mystery still lingered. The photos, the envelope, the anonymous packages. Whoever had been watching hadn't done it for sport. They had been waiting for something, hoping for something. Eleanor sensed that more was coming. It arrived in the form of a small box, left on the front steps early one morning. No name, no return address. Just a plain cardboard box, wrapped in brown paper. Thomas found it before the staff had a chance to notice. He carried it to his office and closed the door behind him. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a single flash drive and a photograph. The photo was old and faded, taken in what looked like a hospital room. A young woman sat in a chair holding a newborn baby, a nurse beside her smiling. The child's shoulder bore the same crescent-shaped birthmark, but it was the woman's face that held Thomas still. She wasn't Eleanor, but she could have been. He remembered her name suddenly, Isabel. She had been a part of his life briefly, in the early years before the company rose to power. She had been smart, soft-spoken, and inconvenient. She had made a mistake by trusting him. When she said she was pregnant, he had made arrangements, lawyers, payments, silence. He never saw the child. He had told himself it was over, that no one would ever find out. He plugged in the flash drive. The screen flickered and displayed a series of video clips, grainy but clear, a sequence of surveillance footage taken from hidden cameras, some in the mansion, some in other places. The footage stretched back over months, maybe longer. It showed Thomas, his routines, his outbursts, his punishments. It showed Eleanor crying alone in the nursery. It showed the child, bruised once, sleeping in silence. It showed everything, and then it cut to a new scene. A young man stood in a parking garage, speaking directly to the camera. His features were sharp, his voice calm. He introduced himself only once. His name was Michael, Isabel's son. The child Thomas had paid to forget. Michael looked nothing like Thomas, but he carried the same intensity, the same quiet fire. He spoke about his mother, about how she never recovered from what Thomas did, how she died too young, leaving behind only fragments of a life stolen from her. Michael had spent years piecing them together, photos, bank statements, emails. And then he found Eleanor. He had watched her from a distance, terrified of what he might find. But the more he saw, the more he realized she was trapped the same way his mother had been, only worse. Controlled, watched, hurt. So he began leaving breadcrumbs. The camera, the photos, the envelope. He didn't want revenge. He wanted the truth to be seen. By Thomas, by Eleanor, by the world, if needed. The video ended with a final message. You can't erase people, not forever. We remember, we survive, and we come back. Thomas sat frozen in his chair long after the screen went black. Everything he thought he had buried had returned, not with rage, but with proof. Quiet, devastating proof. He had created his own reckoning. That night, he didn't lock his study door. He left it wide open. The box and its contents sat in plain view. Eleanor found them early the next morning. She watched the footage alone, her son sleeping quietly beside her. As Michael's face filled the screen, she understood everything. The mark, the surveillance, the message. It wasn't just her story anymore. It was a legacy of harm, stretching back further than she realized. And it had to end. Eleanor packed a small bag. She didn't rush. She gathered only what mattered. Documents, a few clothes, the baby's essentials. She waited until sunrise, then left the mansion through the back entrance. She didn't take a car. She walked, baby in her arms, down the long driveway until the estate disappeared behind the trees. Thomas didn't follow. He watched her from the window, unmoving. He didn't call out. He didn't stop her. He couldn't. The world he built had already fallen apart, and the only thing left to do was let it go. Days passed, then weeks. The house remained empty, its silence deeper than ever. Thomas signed papers. He transferred ownership of properties, donated large sums to unnamed charities. Slowly, quietly, he dismantled the empire. The footage eventually leaked. Not all of it, just enough. A journalist received the package anonymously and published a limited story, discreet but damning. The public never saw the full truth, but those who mattered did. Investors pulled out. The board resigned. His name faded from headlines faster than expected. No one knew what became of Thomas Wycliffe. Eleanor, now living in a quiet coastal town, raised her son with care. She never spoke of the mansion again. The past remained locked behind her eyes, and the child grew strong, curious, and kind. The mark on his shoulder remained, but she no longer feared it. It wasn't a curse. It was a warning passed through blood. A reminder that even those born in darkness could bring light. And somewhere, in a different city, a young man named Michael watched from afar, satisfied not by revenge, but by justice. Not loud, not violent, just enough to set things right.